Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. I'm Melissa. I'm the stage manager in here. I'll be giving you your cues.
Okay, thank you, Melissa.
Your
I'm
camera
Maria Victoria,
looks.
Ministry of Education of Colombia.
Yes, welcome. Let me just update your
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. My name is David Evans from the Center for Global Development, and welcome to this World Bank and Global Education Monitoring Report webinar entitled Inclusion and Education, Fulfilling Everybody's Potential. And that's what we're going to dig into today. We're going to get into how to make sure that all children, including children from marginalized ethnic groups, including refugee children, including disabled children, all these children who often get overlooked, how can we make sure all children get access to a quality education? What will it take to accelerate progress towards inclusion and make sure that resources are used more effectively, more equitably? And especially in this moment, how can we make sure that COVID-19 doesn't leave the most vulnerable children behind? I want to welcome all of our online viewers. We have many people on the platform, countless others watching this event on YouTube. If you're on the platform, please share the city and country where you're calling from in the chat. We're very excited to be holding this webinar just 2 days after the global launch of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, Inclusion and Education, All Means All. And first off, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that everyone can participate fully in today's event. So today's event is available to view in English, in Spanish, in French, as well as in American Sign Language. If you're joining on the platform and you'd like to change your language, go up to the top of the screen on the navigation menu and select Watch Live Event in your preferred language. Live captioning is also available for today's event. So if you're watching on Facebook, click on the settings wheel to enable live captions. We also want to thank everybody who's posed questions before the event began. We want to hear from you. We'll get to some of those questions later in the session. Obviously, because we only have an hour and a half, we won't get to everyone's questions, but we do invite you to type in additional questions in the live chat or on Twitter using the hashtag #AllMeansAll. As I say, we might not be able to address all of them today, but we will certainly be collecting them and continuing to discuss them. So briefly, I just want to introduce, we've got an amazing lineup of speakers today. I'll give a quick introduction and then we will jump straight into the content. So first, we will have Gordon Brown, the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education and the former Prime Minister for the United Kingdom. We'll hear from Manos Antoninis, the Director of the Global Education Monitoring Report for UNESCO. We'll hear from Maria Victoria Angulo, the Minister of Education for Colombia, from Jaime Saavedra, the Global Director for Education at the World Bank, from Gillian Triggs, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, Joshua Josa, the Disability Inclusive Education Specialist at USAID, Daniel Mont, the Co-President of the Center for Inclusive Policy, and Vibhu Sharma, a Disability and Inclusion Specialist at Their World, a global children's charity, and Ewan Platt, the Executive Director of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Intersex Youth and Student Organization, or IGLIO. So we have a big group of great speakers. I'm going to remind speakers to keep your comments focused so that we can make sure to hear from everyone on how we can move the needle on inclusive quality education for all children. So first off, we're going to hear some opening remarks from Gordon Brown, the UN Special Envoy for Global Education, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and a great advocate for global education. So, Mr. Brown.
David, the Global Monitoring Report is a landmark event. It's a treasured moment in the world of education, and it's the launching pad, the starting point every year for a renewed effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in education. And so I'm pleased to be here at the launch. Thank Manos for what he has done and his team, and thank all of you for participating in this important event. And never was the theme, inclusion for all, more important. 1.2 billion children out of school, 500 million who can't access the internet, 300 million denied school meals, 50 million children forcibly displaced, child marriage rising. We saw in the Ebola epidemic, it doubled in Sierra Leone, child labor likely to rise, child trafficking, and of course, millions of children who need learning most, unable to learn, and who are in danger, as happened in Pakistan with the earthquake in 2005, to fall behind many months in their education. So this report and its conclusions that I've read very carefully are needed more than ever. And we need a campaign to save our future built around it that emphasizes that we must get 260 million out of school children back to school at all times. We need 400 million children who are denied going on beyond primary education to get the chance to do so. 800 million children who leave school without any qualifications need our help. And our campaign, Save Our Future, also has got to ensure that there's proper financing for education. The report shows that there are at least 50 countries that are spending less than 4% of their national income on education, and that education aid itself is falling from the donor countries. Save Our Future is needed also because we see from the report how many disabled children are being excluded from the benefits of education, and a failure to recognize how we must build on the capabilities of every child. We see also girl discrimination and large numbers of children denied the chance of education, and child marriage, a real problem that has got to be addressed. So Save Our Future, built around this report, must campaign for education. 100 billion is in danger of being taken out of education because governments will spend less, aid will be less, international organizations will do less. We have to hold to the dream that in the next 10 years, we will ensure that every single child has the chance of an education, and we will be the first generation in history to get every child to school. And we must use this report to say that instead of developing some of the potential of some of our children, we will go on to develop all the potential of all of our children. That's how important this report is and how we must build from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those are essential opening comments. We see there is a financing challenge, but also a focus challenge that we have lots of, it'll take a special focus to make sure that all children, not just some children, not just the easiest to reach children, benefit from quality education. So now we're going to watch a short video that gives a few highlights from the Global Education Monitoring Report. So cue the video.
Everyone is different. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education believes that education is strongest when it embraces diversity. Learners should not have to adapt to the system. Instead, education systems should adapt to their needs. When students do not feel welcome in school, they are less likely to learn. This is everyone's loss. But rich and poor countries too often educate some children apart. Children who have a disability, have been displaced, speak a different language, or are poor and disadvantaged. School design may favor some students over others, as do many laws and policies. Teachers are often ill-equipped to cater for students' diverse needs. Children may not recognize the way they are portrayed in textbooks. Some may not see themselves there at all. They receive the message that they do not belong. Testing sometimes follows a narrow vision of education, and consequently, some students leave education earlier than they should. These are complex problems to solve, but a belief in the right to education is a belief in inclusion. Children have different learning speeds and needs. They need curricula that are flexible, creative, and relevant. How we prepare teachers matters. They must be given the tools and training to achieve our vision for reform. The resources we know can help the marginalized, educators, support staff, and equipment should be shared so that everyone can benefit. Better data on those left behind will help us reach them. Disadvantages often accumulate. We can't address inclusion one group at a time. Redressing these disadvantages requires funds. These must be equitable and target individual-specific needs. We must work together on these tasks across government ministries, from central to local authorities, with civil society supporting governments, and schools opening doors to the community. Inclusion in education requires a change in mindset in society, so that education for all means education for everyone, without exception. Achieving this is everybody's business, including yours.
So that video gave us, gave us a nice sense of the recommendations from the report, the big picture recommendations. So now we're going to jump right into content from some of our other speakers. And we'll start with Manos Antonimis, the director of this Global Education Monitoring Report. Manos, first, congratulations on the launch of this report. And let me just say the action item, for the audience, if you haven't read this report, the first action item coming out of this webinar is download this report, read this report. As usual with the Global Education Monitoring Report, like the wealth of content is really staggering. And so that's something to be congratulated on. To kick us off, Manos, we'd love to hear a little bit about your views about the value of inclusive education. Who tends to get left out in countries' definitions of inclusive education? And how can those definitions be widened? And what does COVID-19 bring to all this?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining today. In 2015, the world's countries signed up to SDG 4 and its pledge to achieve inclusive education by 2030. But it might be fair to say that their representatives may not have been actually on the same page, all of them, as to what they signed up to. The case for inclusion had been championed by those courageous advocates and supporters of the rights of people with disabilities who ensured that the right to inclusive education was guaranteed in international law in 2006. But even that text, the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, was ambiguous in some ways. It set a very clear process. Children with disabilities had the right to be educated in the local school alongside all other children. But was that enough? Did that set a clear result? No, if the conditions were not appropriate, meaning that if these children were not receiving the quality of education to which they were entitled. No, if, say, children with disabilities did have access to quality education in the local school, but others did not. This is what actually stirred the debate, a very, very active debate over a period of 10 years before the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities issued its General Comment 4 on the Convention's Inclusive Education article in 2016. What did that comment say? It pointed out that inclusion is not about one group. The mindset and the mechanisms that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those excluded. Every society needs to own up to its mechanisms that exclude. These are not easy issues at all. Every society has to address these questions, these political challenges regarding the kind of society people aspire to achieve through education. There is sometimes a disconnection between those who favor narratives of education as a right and those who favor narratives of education as an investment in human capital. The report argues that this distinction is unnecessary. Clearly, and I'm an economist, it is a bit of a theoretical exercise to quantify the benefits of inclusion. I'm sure there are people who quantify and have quantified the cost of school segregation and racial isolation in the United States. But we don't need to know anything more than the fact that it is an immense cost and it spreads over generations. But there are some tangible benefits of inclusion in the short term. The richest are 3 times more likely than the poorest in low and middle income countries to complete lower secondary school. And among those who do complete lower secondary school, the richest are 2 times more likely than the poorest to learn basic skills. Halving learning poverty, as the World Bank has put it, or eliminating, as the international community said perhaps more ambitiously, by 2030, will not be achieved only with technical interventions on how to learn how to read. It requires thinking about the experience of the student. Their well-being matters. Stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination means that millions of children are alienated inside classrooms and less likely to progress and benefit from education. I will not say much about the individual groups, as we have an excellent panel here to reflect on this point, but to bring it to COVID-19, which added another layer of inequality complexity. The report's key message is clear that hundreds of millions of children have actually had their learning stopped. This is not to discount great government efforts around the world. Colombia has done wonders. But think of the best case scenario, teachers who have had some type of online contact. They nevertheless have lost contact with many. They have struggled to communicate with parents, and they have seen the reality of the homes of the most disadvantaged. But this, and I would conclude my point, could be a sign of hope, that this additional check with reality will have sensitized the education community about the challenges some of its members are facing.
I hope that's true. I hope, as I look at the COVID-19 reaction and a lot of focus on, again, kind of the average student, which a lot of people, a lot of general work. And I really hope that that this crisis is waking people up to the huge challenges faced not only by, all kinds of children, but especially for children with multiple vulnerabilities. Before we move on, I want to get into, one thing. Obviously, these are general problems you've highlighted that every country faces. I know that the JEM team has created an online portal of individual country profiles on inclusion to help us get into what are the specific challenges faced by individual countries. Can you tell us a little bit about this peer education profiles portal?
Yes, indeed. Alongside the reports, we were very excited to launch a new website. PEER stands for Profiles Enhancing Education Reviews. Over the years, the report has focused on monitoring global quantitative indicators. But its twin mandate calls for it to also monitor the implementation of national and international strategies to achieve SDG 4. PEER aims to address this need. I'm sure all of you with an interest in comparative education have asked at some point or another, how does country X or Y approach one or the other education policy issue? In this first edition of PEER, we have included profiles describing how every country approaches inclusion in education through its laws and policies. It is a companion to the report. We use these profiles to map trends on selected issues by region. For instance, we have learned that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusion. Of those, only 57% have a definition that covers multiple groups. 25% of laws around the world call for segregating students with disabilities. Another 48% call for partial segregation. We believe much can be learned from countries sharing experiences, and we hope that PEER will enable precisely this process at the regional or sub-regional level. It's not that we have not had such resources. There have been. The World Bank Saber, for example, has been an inspiration and a valuable source of information for GEM reports over the years. But inevitably, the report needs to have something to say about all countries. We also felt that countries do not all learn in one way. They're a bit like the students we discussed in the report. Sometimes countries like to be given more guidance, an approach that the Saber's Second Life through the policy dashboard is taking. Sometimes countries simply want to see what others are doing without necessarily having the knowledge curated for them. PEER is a little bit like that. It's simply descriptive. But in its ideal use, it should form the foundation, the background for discussions convened by regional organizations where often policy dialogue is not sufficiently well informed. In that sense, our inspiration has been the European Commission's national descriptions of education systems, and this is what we would like PEER to become one day. EU member states were never meant to discuss education. It is a fiercely national area of policy. But they have gradually seen, without pressure or conditions, the benefits of learning from each other by sitting around the table. And the national descriptions have been the key tool. Profiles on different key issues to SDG 4 will be added to those now on the side. We're already working on profiles for our 2021 report, which will have a focus on how countries regulate non-state actors in education. Profiles on equitable financing in education will be published soon as well. A last point to make is that PEER is now part of a group with our other two websites. WIDE, the World Inequality Database on Education, is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year and is actually on an exciting new development path in our partnership with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. And SCOPE, which was launched in January, is an interactive companion to the monitoring part of the report, which allows you to compare trends over time and patterns across countries on SDG 4 indicators, offering very insightful narratives. So we invite you to take a look at all three: education profiles, education progress, education inequalities, which you can access from the homepage of our revamped website.
This is great. This is, as I said before, an incredible wealth of resources for people both working regionally or country leaders working in their individual countries. Thank you, Manos, and congratulations again on the launch of this report. I hope people will follow up and take advantage of these tools. All right, so now we're going to move into the virtual roundtable discussion. We have 7 speakers. First, we're going to hear from 4 speakers representing both country perspectives and multilateral and bilateral aid agencies. We'll hear from Jaime Saavedra, Minister Angulo, Ms. Triggs, and Mr. Josa to talk about the role of governments and multi and bilateral development organizations supporting them. So I'd like to kick off with Jaime. Jaime, so, as the director, the global director for education at the World Bank, we'd love for you to first just give us some reflections on the report's main messages. What do you find is noteworthy? And, how is the World Bank moving the needle on this? Not just boosting education, but boosting these inclusion issues in general, and especially during COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Dave. Look, first of all, I would just want to congratulate the Global Education Monitoring Reports team. I like very much the phrase "all in all," which to a certain extent sounds obvious, right? But unfortunately, we need a report like this to keep us reminding us that everyone has the right to an opportunity, and that we mean it, right? So it seems that's something that we say all the time. Yes, everyone deserves a chance. That's true, but is that happening? And the answer is no, right? And we need to keep on reminding ourselves that that's not happening. And the way Manos referred to inclusion, that report refers to inclusion and talks about all the different dimensions that we need to care about. Children with disabilities, children with different ethnicities or races, children speaking different languages, gender, sexual orientation, makes clear that having a safe and inclusive school is a tall but urgent order. And I use the phrase safe and inclusive schools because the new World Bank education approach talks about safe and inclusive schools as one of its integral pillars. So it's not an add-on. It's not like a box in the report. No, I mean the safe and inclusive school is one of the main 5 pillars, together with prepared learners, teachers, pedagogical approaches at the classroom level, management, and safe and inclusive schools. It's our 4th pillar of our strategy. Just to ensure that in all operations, all children should have a meaningful experience. Now, I want to mention and close this intervention with mentioning 2 issues. One is and let me first focus on one specific issue. I mean, there are many things that we can talk about, different types of exclusions that we see, but let me focus on the one on that it's mother tongue, right? We have about 40% of children who are not taught in their language that they speak at home. And that's probably one of the main reasons of why we had such high numbers of learning poverty, right? In many countries, of children who by age 10 cannot read and understand, and that's really tragic, right? And sounds obvious. They should be taught in their mother tongue, but it's difficult. And we need to recognize that there are pedagogical challenges. There are the challenges of finding teachers that can speak both languages, and sometimes there are political challenges. So, but I mean, that's something that we really need to address. And the second point I wanted to mention is that the task that we have in front is complex and it's very heterogeneous. And we need to, and it implies solving many different types of problems. So it's solving from simple problems, so making sure that all children have glasses, right, to the more complex behavioral issues, that making sure that parents never hide their children at home with children that could have a disability, or the much more complex projects of how to give the right support with a child with a severe disability, for instance. So that's why we have made the commitment that by 2025, all World Bank operations will be disability inclusive. That's only one angle, right, of this inclusiveness that we're talking, but it's an absolutely critical angle.
Thanks, Jaime. I just want to ask one follow-up question on this. You mentioned the political aspects of mother tongue instruction, and it's been exciting to see some countries making real advances in that area. Obviously, pursuing inclusive education broadly has real political implications, and I'm sure you saw that as Minister of Education in Peru, as well as at the World Bank. What has to change? Like, what has to change in the political discourse to make sure that refugees and migrants and learners with disabilities are included?
Let me mention three things. First is that when we design policies, we'll need to design for the more marginalized and the most vulnerable, right? If we design with those children in mind, most likely we're going to be covering everyone, right? That's obviously makes design of policies more complicated, but public policy is complicated. And in the case of COVID, for instance, the COVID response that many countries have been implemented, I think it's great to see that many countries are saying we cannot afford to just use online materials. We need to use online radio and TV, right, and printed materials, because that will be the only way in which we can reach all kids. So that's the right approach, right? Now, the implementation has been much more complicated, right? And the degrees of effectiveness much very different, but that's the way to go. My second point is that we need to recognize that nothing is for free and nothing is easy. And when we say that all children deserve the same opportunity, right? All children deserve the opportunity of a good experience in the classroom. But making sure that everyone has the same opportunity might imply very different efforts from the point of view of the system, and might imply very different expenditures. So that everyone has the right experience and everyone has the same experience doesn't mean that you need to spend the same on every child, right? Given the right education to a child in a rural area, or a child with a disability, or a child that we need to teach in two languages, it's more expensive. Well, so be it. That's life, right? It will be more expensive for certain children than for others. But that is what we need to do if we want to give the same opportunity to everyone, or the right opportunity to everyone. And then my third point is that we cannot afford, and I'm thinking now, for instance, in the case of refugees, we cannot afford to have parallel systems, right? In which there's one system for one group of people and another system for another group of people. Usually the quality will be different, but even let's assume that the quality is the same, right? For some reason, we had the resources that we gave the same quality. That's not enough. We need to have one integrated system, because that diversity of having people with different backgrounds in the same school system, that increases that increased diversity gives much more richness to the system. If there are two systems, then there's a system for the other, and for other people will say, well, that's the system of the other one, right? So there's the other and there's no us, right? So that's what we need to make sure, that we have integrated systems, for instance, in the case of refugees. So and let me close then. I mean, all this is very complicated, right? This is a tall order, and is a tall order for education. So that's why we need to emphasize this campaign of Safer Future, in which all international organizations and many CSOs are working, and a campaign that gives us shapes an aggressive shared agenda, right, for action. Because we were already saying 5 months ago that we were living a learning crisis. That's what I would have said in January. Now we have a much more serious crisis, a learning crisis that has been magnified by this pandemic. Our baseline is lower, the inequities are larger. So the challenge that we have is even more complicated. But still, even in that framework, we need to do all we can and put the resources that it can, and we need to put all the political, financial, and management commitment that is needed to give everyone a chance. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Jaime. No, it's absolutely true. And I think, it's an ongoing challenge to actually shift the political discourse so that countries and donors are willing to invest that extra that it often costs to reach children with additional vulnerabilities. Now I'd like to pose a question to our Minister of Education for Colombia, the Honorable Maria Victoria Angulo. So, Minister Angulo, under your leadership, of course, the Ministry of Education in Colombia is working to implement the National Education Plan. the road towards equality and equity. And Colombia also co-organized an international forum on inclusion and equity. Can you tell us a little bit about how Colombia is moving towards inclusion through a combination of laws and policies and actions, and why you see that as important?
Thank you, David, and good morning to everyone. As 2020 Gen report shows, education continues to suffer today from exclusion and discrimination through the world. In Colombia, our social and natural diversity has led us historical to be conscious to the importance and cultural and ethical diversity. For this reason, since inaction in 1991 of current Colombian political constitution, our country has bet on guarantee quality education for all. In this end, the National Ministry of Education in Colombia has defined inclusion in education as a permanent process which recognizes, values, and respond with the pertinence to the diversity of characteristics, interests, possibility, and expectation of children, adolescents, young people, and adults. This pertinence is centered in driving all people towards integral development and participation in a discrimination and exclusion-free learning environment. This is the principal goal. It involves also guarantee within the framework of human rights that require reasonable supports and adjustment to reduce gaps and promoting practices, policies, and cultural settings that eliminate all barriers present in the education context. The 2020 Gen report shows to around 70% of the countries still reduce their definition of inclusion education for people with disability, and although it's very important and necessary to continue making efforts to include this particular population group. In Colombia, we are aware that inclusion and equity in education must transcend focus on a specific population group and strive to make reality the dream of guarantee quality education for all, independently of each person's specific conditions and characteristics. In accordance with this, National Ministry of Education has made its objective to establish an official document of policy, guideline for inclusion and equity in education. This document provides orientation and guidelines to general community to incorporate and implement the proposed principal approach in education project, strategies, and action, taking into account a broad definition of quality education and lifelong learning opportunities in the context of inclusion, equity, and human development to generate conditions to equal opportunities for all. Within the region, Colombia has had an important leadership role regarding inclusion and equity. This position demands that education policy and practice in all levels and contexts should be guided, strengthened by general principle of inclusion. Finally, the ministry has also made efforts to be able to guarantee complete education trajectories based on the principle of inclusion and no discrimination. Two important examples of this effort are the Early Childhood Education Program and the Higher Education Program Generation E. This is the name of the program. Regarding to first one, we are moving forward to guarantee an integral service to more than 2 million children, so they have access to early childhood attention and develop service in warm, safe, and protected environments. In higher education, in Generación E, strive offer optimal conditions for young people in vulnerable conditions from all over the countries to access, continue, and graduate for higher education program. And for us, this is the way to achieve social transformation and develop all regions, including the most remote. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Minister Angulo. I'd just like to ask one follow-up question for you. Sounds like an amazing agenda. What would you say has been one of the greatest challenges, one of the greatest obstacles that you've encountered as you've sought to put this in place?
Okay, David. One of the biggest disparity in education, Colombian education, must tackle to achieve prosperous, equitable, and peaceful society is in the urban and rural area. For this reason, the National Development Plan has dedicated a specific section to rural education policy, prioritizing in rural areas all the policy programs, but considering specific characteristics and needs. This prioritization is reflected in the National Development Plan, follow-up indicators specifically directed toward rural school population. Some examples are rural upper secondary net coverage rate, number of public rural schools with good and excellent outcomes in severe evaluation, the immediate transit rate to higher education institutions in rural areas, and the literacy program specifically for rural areas.
Thank you very much. And that's an important highlight. We talk about marginalized groups, and these include a lot of different groups, including just kids from rural areas that don't even have necessarily other vulnerabilities at play. Thank you, Esther. Now, I'd like to pose a question to Gillian Triggs, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR. So, refugee education is a huge challenge. I was recently reading research on the incredibly low learning outcomes. As Jaime said earlier, we've talked about a learning crisis for kids, for refugee children. That is an even greater challenge, often with limited access to education as well as outcomes. And so, what action would you say, what do we need at the international level to make sure that equity and inclusion are central to the education for refugees and for host communities?
Well, thank you very much. And perhaps I could begin by saying how very pleased we are at UNHCR, the refugee agency, to have the GEM report, because it gives us one of those tools that we need, which is evidence-based data on which we can develop our advocacy for inclusion. Inclusion is the major recommendation of this report, and inclusion really is the word of the decade, if not the century. It's where we all have to go. Perhaps I could begin by saying, of course, there has to be an international dimension to this ambition, to this objective of inclusion. And for UNHCR, it does begin, if I may, 2 years ago with the Global Compact on Refugees. And this was a resetting of the needs and the international responses to the unprecedented numbers of people leaving for reasons of conflict or persecution. Now, perhaps I could say that we've just released our figures, our data, which is that something very close to 80 million people last year were refugees, asylum seekers, displaced within their own country, or stateless and unable to find any solutions, and excluded by virtue of their status. Now, that number is unprecedented, but 50% of them, at least, are children and youths. So that's the dimension of the problem. We've never seen anything like it globally. But that brings me back to the Global Compact. The point in 2018, with these rising numbers, was to agree upon some fundamental principles, and that the international community did. And those principles were basically of two kinds. One, a need to resolve the problems of inclusion through solidarity, through global and regional solidarity. And the second principle was that we have to accept that every nation has to share equitably the burden and responsibility for movement, so that we have a reality in which 85% of the 80 million that I was talking about, and these numbers are almost incomprehensible, but 85% of them are hosted by poor countries or middle-level developing countries. And Colombia, and it's wonderful to speak after the minister from Colombia, Colombia is one of those most important hosts, but bearing the burden. And I don't like to use the word burden in relation to refugees, but nonetheless, it's a burden and responsibility. So those were the international responses to the general question of refugees 2 years ago. And in December last year, we had a forum with 1,400 pledges to try to link up the responsibilities of the global north, broadly speaking, and the huge responsibilities picked up in the global south. Now, nobody could have imagined when that compact was agreed that within weeks of this inspiring agreement and of support through the General Assembly, that we would have the COVID-19. And what has happened then is that COVID-19 as a global epidemic and pandemic has shone a light on the very facts that are in the GEM report. the fragility of education systems, and of course health systems and many other things, but today we're talking about education. COVID has shone a light on the inequalities globally, the futile exercise of classifying people according to particular migration, asylum, stateless, or whatever legal capacities. A pandemic of this kind is no respecter of borders, no respecter of wealth or economic status, and certainly no respecter of vulnerable people. So we saw with the epidemic the need for international action along the lines of solidarity and global responsibility sharing in a way that almost no other event could possibly have demonstrated. And so I have some, of course, optimistic view that we will now start to see these problems in a more global sharing way. Well, you might say, well, why would I speak so particularly about refugees and displaced people? And the answer really lies in the perhaps obvious point that they are the most vulnerable people among other vulnerable people. And a very significant number of people who are refugees and displaced in their own country are also disabled. It's a shocking statistical fact. So what we're dealing with is vulnerability to the communities generally. But then we see that vulnerability being shown up in particular with the loss of jobs, the social and economic consequences of COVID-19, where the first people to lose their jobs were refugees and asylum seekers, displaced people, because they're in the informal global economy and they're the first to lose their jobs. And once you see, and it was astonishing how quickly we saw these statistics, once the lockdown occurred and the jobs were lost, we saw a spike in sexual-based violence and a spike in abuse and exploitation of children, who, as Mr. Brown has pointed out, 1.2 billion children out of school and nearly 300 million children still out of school. So these are huge problems that where we've got a pandemic upon existing crises, huge conflicts in parts of the world, famine, and pre-existing fragile circumstances. So what do we do about it? Of course, we argue to go back to the principles of the Global Compact, but we also argue for some of the points that have been made by Jaime from the World Bank. You cannot have parallel systems. You cannot have systems that are dependent on particular status. But perhaps I could add to what he was saying. We do need a very strong engagement by the banks, by the international banking system, to ensure flexible funding to countries that are hosting refugees, and to ensure that it's possible to get cash-based support to those that need it as quickly and as cost efficiently as possible. So I'll finish there, but there are many, many issues that arise from your question. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Ms. Triggs. And I think that this final point that you've made, that there's been a fabulous commitment, but if we want this to happen, especially in the wake of COVID-19, financing has to happen. Like this doesn't happen. Providing education isn't free, and these hosting countries need some support from the international community, financial support, to be able to deliver on that responsibility. Thank you. So now we'll come to USAID. We're going to talk to Josa, the Inclusive Education Officer. So, given your role representing USAID and the Global Action on Disability Networks Inclusive Education Working Group, can you tell us, from the bilateral perspective, how you are working with other donors to support the development of inclusive education systems in different country contexts? What's USAID doing, and what can other bilateral donors be doing?
Great. Yes, I can definitely do that. In terms of donor coordination, it's really critical to achieving inclusive education. One way the members of the GLAD network, Inclusive Education Working Group, are collaborating is by promoting common key messages. One of those key messages is promoting the principles of universal design for learning. UDL is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all based on the science of learning. To support that framework, we encourage programs and various stakeholders to make sure they are equipped with adequate resources to teach the learning materials to all learners in an inclusive environments and provide reasonable accommodations as needed. Many of GLAD's network's key messages are included in the infographic, which helps members have a unified way of communicating about disability inclusive education. These messages use a twin-track approach and engage the disability community throughout the design and implementation process. This is significant as the infographic reinforces the recommendations of the GEM report. You can find the infographic on the GLAD website, and it's available in 5 different languages. Members are working to promote a profound cultural shift within the early childhood all the way up to the post-secondary levels by aiming to build one education system really for all. One example of this work is through All Children Reading, a grand challenge for development. It's a partnership between USAID, World Vision, and the Australian government, which today has launched our new challenge. It's called the Unrestricted Challenge. We're seeking expressions of interest from local and government solvers to scale ICT for education solutions that demonstrate the highest potential to improve language and literacy for early grade children with disabilities. And I strongly encourage you to go to allchildrenreading.org for more information.
Goals.
Really, the role of disability inclusive and disability disaggregated data, simply put, really, if we don't have reliable data that is disaggregated by disability, how can we ever measure the progress for learning outcomes? In addition, disability disaggregated data can help us understand how to better serve each learner and to justify programming and budget flows and for inclusive education overall. Having clarity on the availability and appropriate use of disability measurement tools is vital for being able to collect this data. USAID recently completed a mapping study to gather information from partners on tools and approaches, which led us to develop a disability status tool selection guide. And that is intended to help users determine which tool best fits their purpose for data collection. We are now working with partners to update our guidance on disability data collection and use in the education programming, which will be available later this summer.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, continuing. Excuse me, that tool selection guide is a living document, which is meant to be updated as more tools are identified in the future, created, validated. And so if you are working on something like that, please reach out to us and let us know. USAID also recognizes the need for further investment in creating and validating disability status tools. And they are committed to continuing to invest in this space. Really, ultimately, better data begets improved coordination among donors. And all of this certainly helps with monitoring the CRPD and SDGs and monitoring the outcomes and implementation of quality, equitable, and inclusive education.
Thank you very much. And for anyone who missed it, the CRPD is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I just want to take a moment to thank our first round of panelists. We heard thoughts from Jaime Saavedra from the World Bank on the essential nature of a political commitment for inclusion, recognizing that that doesn't necessarily mean equal resources across groups because it may cost more to actually achieve inclusion, but it just has to be a commitment. We were wonderfully gratified to hear from Minister Angulo about the progress Colombia is making, this essential nature of a plan, and highlighting how the challenge of achieving inclusion in rural areas has been in Colombia and something that other countries are likely to face as well. From Ms. Triggs on the special dual challenge, how COVID has especially hit refugees and other displaced persons, both economically and through education, and that as an international community, we really need to step up and make sure that we are putting resources, flexible resources in place to remedy that. And then from Mr. Hossa about the importance of coordinating and also of making sure that we're gathering data, and the invitation to reach out as different groups are gathering data to bring all of that evidence together. So thank you very much to our first round of panelists. As I say, we'll come back in a little bit with some Q&A. But now we've got another group of panelists that I'm excited to introduce from non-state actors, non-government organizations. So first, I have a question for Daniel Mont, the co-president for the Center of Inclusive Policy. So we've heard about the importance of actions that we need in different sectors, and how inclusion in education is obviously a subset of social inclusion across lots of areas. We heard this from Ms. Triggs about the wide array of challenges that refugees have faced, not just education. So, you know, as you've seen efforts as co-president of the Center for Inclusive Policy, and also as a parent of a student who would benefit from those efforts, what kind of collaboration across sectors would you like to see to more effectively reach those who are furthest behind?
As you point out, life is not lived in silos. And if we want a totally inclusive society, we have to be inclusive across sectors, and they have to work in harmony with each other. So there's many examples, but the two I'd like to focus on have to do with transitions, because transitions, life transitions, are a time when sectors come into contact with each other. So with education, there are two big transitions. There's the transition from early childhood education into the regular school system, and then the transition to work. So for early childhood interventions, it's important that the ECI system communicates with the school system. That when children go into school, the knowledge that's learned about them and the needs they have and how they act, that needs to be transferred to the education system. And then when we're talking about the transition to work, again, the employment sector, the work sector, has to work with the school sector to think about what are the appropriate skills, what are the skills that's demanded in the labor market now. So we're training children in the appropriate way. That internships and mentor relationships are established across the sector, keeping in mind, again, the inclusive nature, and so that these programs reach all children. And then self-advocacy, preparing children not just for what's in the classroom, but preparing them for those who have disabilities or who are in ethnic minorities to be able to be self-advocates. And for schools that are dealing with things like accommodations for children with disabilities in their school, to transfer that knowledge to the workplace, so that the school can help the workplace know how to best make their workplace inclusive, given the particular needs of the child. So those transition periods are really an opportunity for the two sectors to work together.
Thank you so much. And this is a great, a lot of these are the same challenges that we face in general education, right? Getting kids to transition into the workforce, encouraging kids to advocate for themselves. I recently saw evidence from a program in Zambia that trained girls to advocate for themselves and improved both their education and their later outcomes. But it's really important to highlight this, that, even as we invest in these programs generally, they don't automatically, benefit kids who face disabilities or additional vulnerabilities.
Right.
Ewan Platt, I'd like to ask a question. We've talked about refugees, we've talked about kids with special needs. Another group that experiences a lot of discrimination, of course, are LGBTQI youth. One of the most startling figures from the report is from New Zealand, where LGBTQI students were 3 times as likely to be bullied as their peers. So what do governments need to do to support LGBTQI learners so that they feel safe in school?
And thanks, David. The figure from New Zealand is indeed startling. But for those of us working with LGBTQI young people, I'm afraid it's all too familiar. In the recent Fundamental Rights Agency's EU LGBTI survey, 51% of the harassment experienced by young people involve perpetrators from school or college. Similar trends are also present in IGLEO's upcoming education research. We've received over 15,000 responses from young people, and more than 90% had felt discriminated against based on their sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or sex characteristics. The message, therefore, is painfully clear. LGBTQI young people's safety and fundamental rights are still being failed by education systems globally. And while the continued collection of such data remains vital, governments urgently need to move from evidence to action. This means ensuring that national anti-discrimination legislation explicitly mentions and protects learners in relation to their sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. But we know that legislation alone is not enough. National LGBTI plans and anti-bullying strategies are also required to identify specific actions and detail how they will be implemented, monitored, and evaluated. At IGLEO, we have worked with our members across Europe to provide national policymakers with clear guidance on the measures required to effectively tackle bullying and ensure meaningful inclusion within schools. Our LGBTQI Inclusive Education Report and Index used 10 comparable indicators based on a whole school approach to assess the extent to which member states are protecting and supporting LGBTQI learners, both through laws and policies, but most importantly, how they are implemented and made real for learners through practices too. As well as providing a kind of comprehensive account of LGBTQI inclusion in schools, the main purpose of our resources is to guide governments in this work. Through the indicators, we've created a detailed checklist of the measures needed to highlight numerous examples of good practice to demonstrate what can be achieved. In Europe, we know there are 3 areas which require the greatest attention: mandatory teacher training on LGBTQI awareness, the inclusion of positive representations of LGBTI people in school curricula, and robust national bullying data, which is segregated by sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. In the first edition of the index report, out of the 49 countries reviewed, only 5 provided most of the measures, and by contrast, 11 countries had failed to implement any. And while we're hoping to see some improvements in the second edition next year, there is still a long way to go for most member states. In countries where we've seen the greatest progress, effective partnerships between governments and civil society were a recurring theme. The success of these partnerships is strong political commitment backed up by the necessary resources for local governments and civil society organisations to implement the necessary training, support, information and services for teachers, parents and young people. On the other end of the spectrum, we are witnessing public authorities directly attacking LGBTQI rights, such as the establishment of LGBT-free spaces in Poland, the banning of pride marches in Turkey, and proposed and adopted anti-LGBT propaganda laws in several countries. So overall, we're experiencing very slow progress on this issue, even from countries who have shown considerable commitment to LGBTQI rights generally. My final message to governments, therefore, is we already have extensive data highlighting the problems. We know of many effective solutions. There's simply no time nor excuses for further delay.
Thanks so much, Ewan. I have one follow-up question, which is, and I 100% agree, as we think about this work that IGLEO has been doing in Europe is incredibly important, and highlights how these inclusion issues are issues not just in low-income countries and middle-income countries, but very much persistent issues in high-income countries. In many low-income countries, a lot of those data don't exist. I think a lot of the anti-discrimination legislation doesn't exist. What would you recommend for people who are working with low income and lower middle income environments, what's the first step, the first place that people should be working on in order to improve inclusion of LGBTQI students?
Yeah, I mean, I think, our research shows that a kind of multifaceted approach is the most effective when we use a combination of laws, policies, and practices. I think if I had to highlight one thing that governments or countries could do, I would definitely focus on teacher training. I think if teachers and other school staff are not given the appropriate knowledge and skills to confidently address homophobia and transphobia, nor given the guidance and support on how to positively embed LGBTQ identities through their teaching, laws and policies alone will not be translated into real life improvements for learners. I mean, again, going back to Europe where we work, the 2016 Fundamental Rights Agency's publicly professionally speaking report revealed that even in Europe, many countries still lack policies and guidelines, which is then backed up by training for teachers. So unsurprisingly, teachers just are not given the skills and knowledge to effectively deal with these issues when they're presented with them in class.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Now I'd like to pose a question to Vibhu Sharma, the Disability and Inclusion Specialist for Their World. So, okay, around the world, rich countries and poor countries have not been delivering on the promises made to the world's youngest children. Until now, there isn't a single donor who's reached the 10% target of education aid to early child education. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is likely going to amplify challenges for access to education, including early child education for some of the world's most marginalized children, such as children with disabilities. So, in your opinion, what do we need to do to hold government and international actors accountable for the level of reorientation and additional financing that we need to achieve this target?
Thank you for your question, Dave. We are aware that the stage from birth to 5 years is the most critical in a child's life, and over 90% of the brain's development takes place, and that early learning is fundamental for a child's full development, as without access to good quality early childhood education, children risk being left behind, limiting their ability to thrive in school and later in life. However, 175 million children globally are still out of pre-primary education, with more than 80% of children in the world's richest countries having access to good quality early childhood education, and more than 80% in the world's poorest countries denied access. The situation is even elusive for more marginalized children, such as girls, children with disabilities, and children living in conflict-affected areas. This thing reminds us that we still live in the world where people's identity, background, and ability continue to dictate their educational opportunities. And yes, the COVID-19 pandemic is only going to amplify some of these challenges by pushing the children who were already marginalized to even greater marginalization, as they would have been unable to cope up with remote learning, or simply they did not have the means to access it. And when the COVID-19 situation is combined with the scenario before the pandemic, we see a very disturbing picture of discrimination and of exclusion, which in turn pushes us away from our target of achieving SDG 4 by 2030. And in order to achieve SDG 4, we have to realize two things. A, that we need to widen the understanding of inclusive education to include all learners, regardless of their background, identity, or ability. And B, it is critical that we embrace the fact that inclusion cannot wait. For policymakers and stakeholders, ensure that we have policies that exclusively focus on early childhood education for every child, every child, no matter their background or circumstances, should necessarily be guaranteed 2 years of early childhood education. Financing of early childhood education needs a better planning, a better focus on implementation, cost analysis, and scaling up of early childhood education, which is why, for instance, we have their world who is asking all governments and donors to invest at least 10% of their education budget on early childhood education. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ms. Sharma. Can you tell us a little bit more about what their world is doing specifically on this?
Sure, and that's a great question. So at their world, for instance, we believe that there has to be a target financing for those left behind, as there can be no inclusion while millions lack access to education. So we try to respond to the needs of all children, even those who come with multiple marginalization. Our global early childhood education initiative is based on advocacy and prioritization of investments in early childhood education by ensuring that all marginalized children, such as those with disabilities, those living in conflict-affected areas or impacted by a crisis or HIV, have access to early childhood education. And there has to be a cooperation across the government sectors, as ministries need to share administrative responsibilities and thereby build bridges and not walls. So our response to education for refugee children, for instance, is proactively based on partnerships between the government sectors, national and international agencies, UN organizations, and the private sector. In addition, we believe that inclusive systems can be inclusive only when all learners have the ability to learn and benefit from the same flexible, accessible, and relevant curriculum. So there will support teachers by enabling them to adapt to inclusive teaching approaches for children who have additional learning needs in preparatory early childhood education classes. In synthesis, while we at their world strongly believe in an inclusion, we are also very mindful of the challenges that undermine inclusion. And therefore, we are prepared to function with multiple perspectives in multiple scenarios together with the civil society organizations, governments, and other agencies to achieve the promise of inclusion for all children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been great to hear a bit from these, our four subsequent panelists, and Mr. Mont's point about transitions and making sure that kids can advocate for themselves and helping them to do that, not assuming that they'll be able to do that. As we, also as we, with Mr. Platt, the importance of multifaceted approaches and not just waiting on more data, but making sure that we actually proceed with action, including, as a, one action in some places that, might be a first step is training teachers as those who have that initial contact. And Ms. Sharma's point about the huge access problem that we face, especially for kids with multiple vulnerabilities, and the need to adapt these approaches, right? Like, obviously we know there are some best practices, but adapting those approaches for the context is essential. So now we have a few questions, a few minutes for your questions. A number of you have put questions either in the chat or submitted questions when you entered. And I'm gonna draw from those. And so we don't have too long. So again, I encourage the speakers to be focused, but we're excited to continue learning from you. Dana Mont, one of the challenges that we face in low and middle income countries is that many countries are so far from full inclusion, schools that are equipped to fully integrate children with various disabilities or special needs. So in those contexts, does it make sense to first build more effective special units and special schools in the meantime? Or does it make sense to try to leapfrog that? What approach should low-income countries be taking?
Well, yes, complete inclusion can't be done overnight, and it has to be done in steps. And there are definitely examples in lower and middle income countries where those kinds of steps can be taken. But the building of new special schools is not a good idea. It promotes segregation, not inclusion. And it's been shown not to be good for learners, and it will create future barriers. Once you build a special school, now you want to move to inclusion, you have the barrier of the special school. One place where it's a little more complicated is with deaf children because of the importance of sign language. But even there, if there's a school for deaf children, that school also has to be fully inclusive and community-based. And regular schools still have to be fully accommodating for children who are deaf, and students themselves need to have the choice between which school they want to go to. And in terms of special units are fine as long as they are in the support of inclusion. So they're not special units within a school that segregates inside the school, but it's a special unit that has resources and knowledge that can help the general teachers in the regular classrooms, help them be inclusive in their classrooms.
Thank you very much. And I think it's great to hear such a clear directive. One follow-up on that, you mentioned, schools for the deaf, where it may make sense to at least have a special unit because of the importance of sign language interpretation and instruction. But you mentioned the importance of those schools still being inclusive. What does that look like?
Well, that means that it has to still have the inclusive approach to education. The student-centered approach, meeting all the children's needs. The same approach to education, and also for children who have multiple disabilities. There are children who are deaf who are also blind. There are children who are deaf who also have physical disabilities. There are children who are deaf who are from ethnic minorities or other things. So they have to be fully inclusive in that way as well. And as I said, that the children also have the choice of going to the regular community school that has to be fully accommodated for them if they're sign language speakers.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. I'd like to go back again with a question from the audience to Ms. Triggs on refugee education, and especially for inclusion in fragile and conflict, FCV, violent settings or post-conflict settings. Are there good practices or lessons learned, good practice examples you can point to in terms of fostering inclusion in these fragile conflict and violent settings?
Well, thank you. I think perhaps I should start on a more positive note, and that is to say that it has been interesting that most countries accept that they should include refugee children and children of displaced families within their local education systems. So I think what's been very interesting from the GEM report is that the problem is partly inclusion, but it's also partly a serious underfunding of education, and hence the fragility. So the situation with regard to low-income families is particularly exacerbated then when you've got fragile education systems, poor teacher training, and so on. And they've been referred to by many speakers. I think that there are some best practices. And one, perhaps I can talk about the UNHCR itself, because we, of course, have always had some capacity to work in conflict zones where it's hard to get staff in, humanitarian workers in to assist. And we've used remote technologies. But the last 6 months or so, or last 4 or 5 months, have shown that using remote technologies, we can actually get to many, many more people. So we are lifting our own game in developing technologies for remote access, but equally with a purpose to ensure that we get education in remote areas. Conflict is often in remote areas, or natural disasters, and so on. So I think we're going to see a very big change in the use of technologies. Now, there's also the reality that in many of the countries that UNHCR works in, there isn't an internet, there isn't sophisticated technology. And so a good story I can share with you is that Mali, for example, has been with UNHCR support with communities and community groups, localization becoming increasingly important. that they've adopted the simplest of strategies, and that is to buy up radios to ensure that children in conflict areas or areas where they're relatively remote from other technologies and from regular school systems, so that simply using a radio and the channel on those radios, it's possible to provide remote education and get children back into the discipline of school, even though they're in conflict-ridden areas. And that's something I think that we'll see more of in the Sahel. So there are good practices. There is a political understanding, a community understanding of the need to get vulnerable refugees and displaced people into education systems. But the sheer numbers of vulnerable people in need of education has shone the light on the lack of funding and the fragility of those education services.
Thank you very much. It is so gratifying to hear of countries and UNHCR taking positive steps that other countries can adapt and replicate and test and do the research to see what's actually working, what's reaching those kids. That's great. I have a question from the audience for Ms. Sharma. So, what can organizations of people with disabilities do to ensure that their voices are heard in the Build Back Better campaign, right? We're not anywhere near coming out of COVID-19 yet, I don't think, but as schools are reopening and countries are trying to catch up, you've got organizations, advocacy organizations like your own and those that represent specifically persons with disabilities. What can they do to make sure their voices are heard in the national and international stage?
That's a great question again, David. Primarily, I think they need to enhance their advocacy efforts. And while they are doing so, just advocacy does not help. There has to be a clear delivery on the ground. Initiatives such as creating more job opportunities, creating more educational opportunities, skilling, empowerment programs can go a long way. In addition, I think civil society organizations must very strategically plan to do what they want to do and have some objectivized thinking, which helps carving out solutions. At the same time, they need to work in collaboration with the people they are voicing their concerns for. So for instance, if there is an organization which is voicing its concerns for people with disabilities, it needs to work in collaboration with people with disabilities, learning from them what their needs are, and also taking into consideration the solutions that people with disabilities can propose to their problems. So in synthesis, I would say strategic thinking, collaboration, and creating more opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Making sure that they're representing these voices of the people they're working with, this collaboration, that's great. I have a question for Josh. Working there at USAID, how can governments be persuaded to budget for inclusive education rather than financing parallel segregated special needs systems? So we just heard a few minutes ago that what we don't need are more separate schools, totally separated systems. What we need are inclusive, integrated systems. How can we convince governments to budget for those?
And really, that is what I meant. That brings us back to what I mentioned before about data collection, and that is such a critical piece. If those governments have better data, then their capacity to track how much money they're spending, as well as coordination of services and support, will be much improved. And furthermore, when governments understand the data and that it actually costs roughly the same or sometimes less to implement inclusive education, funds can then be funneled towards one education system that, if done well, will utilize the principles of universal design for learning and create a more standard approach, and incorporating Braille and sign language. We can then have an education system really for all of the students that they can all benefit from. And lastly, it's really critical for the governments to continue to be open and share cross-nationally about how inclusive education is effectively carried out within their countries, so that we can all continue to learn from one another, because we cannot be effective without sharing of information and successful coordination.
Thank you very much. And this essential value of collecting data, obviously, like Ewan talked about, and like we'd all agree, not stopping at the data, but making sure there are data that help us to guide funding within the regular within the education system, the main education system. So I'd like to put a question to Ewan Platt about, with LGBTQI youth, you talked about this multifaceted approach. What would you say is the biggest single challenge that prevents countries from achieving inclusion in education? So you mentioned, in terms of an action item, if you had to choose one action item, training teachers. From a policy perspective, what would you say is the biggest hurdle that a lot of countries face?
I mean, yeah, I think one of the main challenges is still a lack of knowledge and understanding of LGBTQI identities and realities. And I think that's why partnerships between governments, schools, and LGBTQI organizations is so essential, in terms of having up-to-date guidance and advice for parents and teachers, but most essentially that there's the support there for young people themselves. I think too often we still see that teachers and other school staff themselves are reluctant to come out as LGBTQI at school. And just if we think for a moment, what message does that send to young people in schools, that it's not safe to be out at school, it's not acceptable to be out at school. So I think we really need to move beyond just having LGBTQI people kind of positively represented through the curriculum, but it also needs to be represented through our school populations and cultures too.
Thank you very much. More inclusive hiring policies and representation. If kids can't see themselves, amongst school leaders and others, then it's difficult to imagine how they'll feel totally safe and comfortable. Manos, and so we're coming down. We don't have time we just have time for a couple more questions, and we will ask them to representatives of the two hosts of this webinar. Since we're running low on time, I will ask them to be focused in their responses. So Manos, globally, there is underinvestment in education, and that tends to further inequities. Can you give any examples that can kind of inspire our imaginations in terms of actual cost-effective investments in inclusive education from low-income countries that have actually improved learning outcomes for learners with disabilities? A lot of us, maybe we're thinking, okay, there's a lot of big picture stuff here, but what are some specific interventions that we might be able to support?
Not all interventions in inclusive education cost necessarily. Just to give an obvious example, I'm sure I gave the translator a hard time before when I spoke, and my team was shouting, no, speak more slowly. Many of these interventions in inclusive education can be very effective without any cost. It's a matter of attitude. It's a matter of having this belief that everyone can learn. But there is a financial problem, of course, and Jaime mentioned that before. Certain interventions, ensuring that every child is taught in their mother tongue, and ensuring that some of the specialist skills are available, is a financial problem. Sometimes it's a planning and management issue. It's a matter of sharing resources. It's a matter of pulling them together and making sure that they're available in the right quantities in all schools, rather than concentrating them in just some areas. But there are also questions of how one can spend more. So the report talks about financing in two levels. First is how governments make sure that they reach the different regions and schools in a way that compensates for the disadvantage. That's something that is often forgotten because we go for the politically easy way of going for, everyone gets the same, and that doesn't help. And then second is the issue of targeting. And their ministries of education can do a lot for learning that it's not just what they do with their own budget, it's how they use the budgets also of other ministries, as Dan was saying earlier, how they collaborate, they exchange information, and the transitions happen properly. But to come to the specific question of an example of that we cover in the reports about effectiveness, and that leads also to learning outcomes, is a combination of all these factors together. The teach at the right level approach that was championed by Pratham in India gets teachers trained to assess the skills of every learner, to get them together, to understand where they are, to group them in ways that are, let's say, not labeling each student, but actually enable them and empower them to learn. And this is an example that has worked well, is cost effective, has been exported and expanded in other countries in the world. It's a good South-South learning example. And finally, it's a good example also to learn about what's waiting for us now, because it's a remedial education program, and that is exactly what governments need to focus their attention to now as schools reopen, and many of the disadvantaged learners will have suffered particularly from the school closures.
Thank you very much, Manos. Our last Q&A question I'll direct to Jaime Saavedra at the World Bank. So, we just heard from Manos about the teaching at the right level and how a big part of that was training teachers. We heard from you and Platt about training teachers. A lot of teachers come to the classroom and just, often haven't been prepared with the skills they need. And this isn't any sort of direct failing of teachers. This is a system that puts teachers in the classroom without even the skills to reach students without special vulnerabilities. How can we make sure that teachers come to the classroom, or teachers that are in the classroom have the skills that they need to reach all students?
Look, thanks, David. Look, the investment that we need to do on teachers is massive, because we cannot expect a teacher in a regular classroom to have the skills, the abilities, the training in order to handle the children with different needs and different types of support. So that's not happened by magic, right? The specific training has to be there for teachers in regular classrooms. I mean, the way Dan put it was very clear. I mean, the main source of our investment should be in making sure that in all schools, well, there will be teachers, right, that will have the right training. In some schools also, you might have a few teachers that have more specialized training, so you'll need to have a combination. And also be cognizant that this will not happen quickly. So you can also rely on people from the community, right, in order to work at least part-time in schools, right, in order to provide the support that might be needed. But I think I want to emphasize, I think one lesson from this pandemic, which is that education is a social experience. At some point, people would be saying, look, with technology, we can solve many of the education problems, and maybe we will not need teachers, right? Obviously, now it's very clear that that's not true, right? That education is a social experience. Teachers, I mean, the magic of learning comes from that interaction between human beings, between the teacher and the student. At the same time, we have learned there is a huge digital divide that we need to close. And that's critical, because technology can make the job of those teachers, particularly those who can teach, who have to work with kids who have some, with any type of different or special need, right? Can make the job of that teacher is easier. And let me close being a bad citizen and mentioning something that you haven't asked, which is, and emphasizing something that others have mentioned, that is the issue of financing. None of this is for free. And true, some things, I mean, we need to be creative, we need to be more efficient, right? But the levels of expenditures per pupil, right, in most low and middle income countries are just too low, right? And that will have to change. And that will have to change even now more with this crisis. So in that regard, this campaign that also Gordon was mentioning about save our future, I mean, investing in our children is about saving our future, right? And unfortunately, I don't think that all the right audience is the one that is connected today. A good chunk of the audience who is connected today is convinced that that's critical. But we really need to reach out to the macro financial complex, to the budgetary decision-making process, right? And really make sure that they are internalizing that this saving our future is about investing more in children. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Jaime. Spend more and spend more inclusively. So we're running just a couple of minutes over, but I do want to do one final exercise to wrap it up. So there's no country in the world that has truly achieved inclusive education. Something that the Global Education Monitoring Report has launched is a poll for people to participate in, no matter where they live. And a link for that has gone up in the chat. And it's a poll of which of these GEM report recommendations should be prioritized first in your country. And then we can send those you can send those poll results to your education minister. This is an opportunity to have your say. So obviously there's no one right answer. I'm going to read these recommendations, and then we're just going to do a final quick roundabout of our panelists and ask them to just give us the number of which of these recommendations they would prioritize. Recommendation 1 is widen the understanding of inclusive education. It should include all learners, no matter their identity, background, or ability. Recommendation 2, target financing to those left behind. There's no inclusion while millions do not access education. Number 3, share expertise and resources. It's the only way to sustain a transition to inclusion. Number 4, engage in meaningful consultation with communities and parents. Inclusion cannot be enforced from above. And obviously, if you follow the link in the chat, you can read along. Number 5, deliver jointly across government departments, sectors, and tiers. Inclusion in education is just a subset of social inclusion. Number 6, make space for non-government actors to challenge and fill gaps, but also make sure they work towards the same inclusion goal. Number 7, apply universal design, ensure inclusive systems fulfill every learner's potential. Number 8, prepare, empower, and motivate the education workforce. All teachers should be prepared to teach all students. Recommendation 9, collect data on and for inclusion with attention and respect, avoid stigmatizing, labeling. And 10, learn from peers. A shift to inclusion is not easy. So I'm going to go around our panelists in the order that we heard from them initially, which means Manos gets the first vote. Manos, what comes in for you?
I go for 8, empower and prepare teachers to be ready to teach all learners.
Thank you, Manos. Jaime.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Manos won. I mean, I was going to say the same thing, so sorry for not being original.
That's okay. You're allowed to have a winner in a democracy. Ms. Gillian Triggs.
I go for number 1, and that is that we need a better understanding of the need for inclusive education, particularly inclusion regardless of identity and status, background, etc.
Thank you very much. And I didn't mention before, unfortunately, Minister Angulo had to leave. We were very grateful for her participation. Josh Hosa, which recommendation do you choose?
I choose number 7, that's related to universal design for learning.
Thank you. Daniel Mont.
Good, but I'll go with 8.
All right, and just to remind everybody, number 8, get those teachers prepared. Ewan Platt.
I'm going to follow the same trend as 8 as well.
Very good. And Ms. Vibhu Sharma.
I go for recommendation 1, widen the understanding of inclusive education to include all learners, regardless of their ability, identity, or background.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our speakers. We clearly see some real concentration on numbers 1 in terms of a primary step that countries and organizations can take, and then the teachers as a very concrete action in terms of putting things in place. Again, I want to thank all of our speakers. And just to close, I know we're out of time. At this point, we have done what international organizations tend to do best, which is we have written a great report. And congratulations again to the Global Education Monitoring Report team. This is a fabulous piece of work. And we have held a meeting, which is another thing that as international organizations and national organizations we're good at. And so I think one of the things that I would say is that we just have to make sure that we don't stop with that. If you haven't read the report, download it, read it. We've heard several recurring themes here, the importance of a focus and a political commitment. And that's something that we can all influence with influencing our local ministers of education, as well as the heads of our organizations. And the importance of a financial commitment. This won't happen without the financing that we need. As Mano said, there are some interventions that happen just because of awareness, but then obviously there are others that do require additional resources. We have to make sure that we make the case for those, and that the impact of this global education monitoring report doesn't end with these events, but rather starts with these events. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the team who put this event together. There's been a large behind the scenes team for this event, and hopefully we can all go forward and lobby and work for inclusive education, because all means all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks
Bye.
to everyone. Thanks, Manus, for the
We live in a world where no two people are the same. Each of us with our own unique abilities and challenges, preferences and dreams. A diversity that should be reflected across our school systems. But for many, it is not.
मी विचार केला की जर मोठ्या घरचे लोक शिकू शकतात तर आपण का नाही शिकू शकत. माझी तर इच्छा होती. त्याच्यानंतर हा पण विचार आला की माझ्या आई-वडिलांनी वर्षानुवर्ष रस्त्यावरती राहून काढले. मग त्यांना पण माझी इच्छा होती की त्यांना पण असं म्हणजे सगळे घरामध्ये राहतात. मला पण इच्छा आहे की मी पण एक स्वतःचा रूम घेईल शिकून मोठी झाल्यावरती.
By 2030, we aim to achieve inclusive education for all, no matter the region, income, or challenge ahead. This is the decade of action, and together we must ensure that all really does mean all in every classroom. To achieve true inclusion, we will need to place students' differences at the core of our education systems, understanding them as strengths to be celebrated, not as problems to be solved. From children to policymakers, parents to principals, everyone will need to get involved. countries will need to understand the challenges and underlying disadvantages facing their students and directly address each individual's multi-layered needs. Inclusion cannot be achieved one group at a time. It requires more and better data on those being excluded from education to make the invisible visible again.
Accurate data is important for everything as a great starting point.
To make data come alive for action, you need these very lively and sustained partnerships.
But simply moving students from special schools into mainstream schools that lack the appropriate resources will not work. It requires a complete shift in systems and teachers that are well trained with the right learning materials and assessments to meet the needs of their students.
Guter Unterricht ist für uns kooperativer Unterricht, in dem Schüler auch gemeinsam Probleme lösen, nicht immer nur der Lehrer gefragt ist. Das heißt, ich verlasse meinen Status der allwissenden Lehrperson.
We need to break down preconceptions about particular groups to ensure that all children feel welcome in school and have the chance to thrive.
We believe that everybody at the lab is an agent of transformation. Some of them report that the lab gave them a voice. We help them in this way as to become protagonists, to awaken their potential.
Across the world, governments and policymakers will need to ensure equitable financing. Allocating these resources to children that are the furthest behind will need to be planned jointly.
Partnership cannot be overemphasized. So you may not be a health person, but you may be an administrator, you may be an innovator. We can put all of these to the table and then make it work.
The path ahead will have its challenges, but working together, learning from our peers, we can ensure that all means all, and every child has the chance to reach their full potential.